Hey there, lovely soul. So glad to see you back on Noah's Stories. How have you been lately? If today's been a long one, I'm here to share something truly special with you. This is the story of a man who stopped believing in love until he met a woman who came from a completely different world, a marriage that started as a deal but ended with something quietly magical: real emotion. So, are you ready to dive in? Logan West wasn't the kind of man who believed in romance. With his sharp looks, confident charm, and a real estate empire built from scratch in the heart of Los Angeles, he had no shortage of women interested in him, but none had ever touched his heart. The reason? Logan's past was far from simple. As a child, he watched his mother walk out on his father, leaving behind a man broken and bitter. The image of his dad slumped in an armchair, silently drinking under a stormy sky, haunted Logan for years. From that, he drew one harsh conclusion: love only leads to pain. So, Logan chose control over vulnerability. He built a life of structure and independence. He had everything: a luxurious mansion, sleek sports cars, and short-lived relationships that never lasted more than a few weeks. Love, marriage, anything that threatened to shake his grip on life. He kept it all at arm's length. To Logan, the world made sense through numbers, contracts, and power. The heart? Just a liability he refused to indulge. Emotions were messy, unpredictable, and dangerous. But as fate often does, it had its own plans. And it came crashing into his perfectly calculated world in the most unexpected way, beginning a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew. That morning, Logan had just left the gym, sweat still clinging to his skin, when his phone rang. It was Mr. Aldridge, his family's longtime attorney. His voice was deep and measured. "We need to meet. It's urgent. It concerns your grandfather's will." Logan didn't think much of it. His grandfather, Harold West, had always been stern, traditional, and emotionally distant, especially after Logan's mother left. Logan walked into the meeting like he was heading to a finance briefing, but what Mr. Aldridge said next flipped his world upside down. To inherit the full estate and business shares from your grandfather, you must get married within the next 10 days. If not, everything will be transferred to a charitable foundation he established. Logan stared blankly. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious. It's written clearly in the will, legally notarized, witnessed, and binding. If you don't fulfill the condition, the assets are permanently locked away." Part of Logan wanted to walk out. The idea of being forced into marriage just to claim money felt like an insult. But another part, the cold, calculating part, kicked in. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about power, control, legacy. And for the first time in years, Logan found himself staring down the one thing he'd always avoided: marriage. 3 days passed, and Logan still hadn't made a decision. He toyed with a few names: models, businesswomen who had graced his arm at lavish events, but none seemed trustworthy enough for a marriage, even a fake one. The idea of hiring someone through an elite matchmaking agency briefly crossed his mind, but Logan hated the thought of becoming a circus act or someone's target. He needed someone who understood exactly what this was: a contract, not a romance, no illusions, no strings. Then, on a quiet evening while seated in his study, Logan's eyes drifted to one of the security monitors. His gaze paused on a familiar figure: Elena, the housemaid, who silently cleaned the living room every night. Elena had been working in his home for almost a year. She was quiet, efficient, and consistently precise in everything she did. But more than that, there was something real about her. She never tried to impress him, never looked at him like a lottery ticket. She had once been an art student, but after losing both her parents suddenly, Elena dropped out to work full-time and support her younger brother, who was still in high school. Logan hadn't asked, but he'd overheard the story from his house manager, and tonight, watching her calm expression through the screen, a wild idea began to take shape. She wouldn't use him. She needed money. He needed someone he could trust. It might have been a crazy idea, but to Logan, Elena just might be the most logical answer to an impossible problem. The next day, as Elena was cleaning the living room windows, Logan walked in. For the first time since she had started working there, he spoke to her not with a request or a command, but with a question that left her stunned. "Elena," he began, his voice lower and slower than usual, "I have an unusual proposal." She turned around, brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I need to get married. Within 10 days, not for love, because of my grandfather's will, and I want you to be my wife in this arrangement." Elena stood frozen, as if she hadn't heard him right. "You're joking, right?" "I'm serious," Logan said, locking eyes with her. "We'll get married, live together for a short time to make it official, and I'll secure the financial future of you and your brother." Elena clenched her hands, her heart pounding. A part of her screamed that this was ridiculous. She was just a maid. How could she possibly fit into his world, even temporarily? But then she thought of the overdue bills, her brother's tuition, and the rent that was days from default. This deal could change everything, if she was brave enough to take it. "Can you explain what exactly you want me to do?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Just play the role of my wife for 10 days. I'll handle all the costs, the wedding, our stay, everything. After that, you're free to walk away with enough money to never worry again." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, with visible hesitation, she gave a soft nod. "All right, I'll do it." 3 days later, a strange kind of wedding took place in the quiet corners of the West Estate. No expensive wine, no glamorous guests, no loud laughter. Just a small garden behind the mansion, a few neatly arranged chairs, and simple white flowers scattered on the table. Elena wore a last-minute tailored wedding dress. No elaborate lace, no flowing veil, just a soft silk gown that gently hugged her frame. Her hair was tied back simply, her face barely touched by makeup, and yet she radiated a quiet, honest beauty. Logan stood at the end of the aisle, looking like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, poised, distant, unreadable. As Elena walked toward him, they exchanged only a slight nod. No smiles, no small talk. They weren't lovers. This wasn't a marriage born from passion. This was a transaction. After signing the marriage certificate and receiving a polite congratulations from Mr. Aldridge, the lawyer handed over another surprise instruction. According to the will's stipulation, the two of you must spend the next 10 days living together at a countryside farm in rural Oregon, with no return to the city during that time. Logan raised a brow. A farm, not Maldives or some beach villa? Elena was just as surprised but stayed quiet, glancing at Logan curiously. Mr. Harold believed that love, real or fake, only reveals itself when all the glitter of wealth is stripped away. You'll need to live as ordinary people. A few hours later, their luxury SUV pulled away from the estate, winding through long roads, leaving the city behind. Logan remained mostly silent, occasionally glancing at Elena, the girl who was unexpectedly becoming part of his life. The farm sat in the middle of a vast meadow, a 2-story whitewashed wooden house with a balcony facing pine-covered hills. From afar, it looked peaceful, almost picturesque. But inside, Logan was speechless. Creaky floors, an old wood-burning stove, no espresso machine, no air conditioning, and no staff. "Welcome to the weirdest honeymoon in history," he muttered, half joking, half defeated. Elena simply laughed and pulled her suitcase inside. She was used to simplicity, but Logan, a man who had never lived without luxury, was about to step into a world completely unknown to him. The first day on the farm began with a battle over coffee. Logan wrestled with an old drip pot while Elena was tidying up the kitchen. "I can't believe there's no espresso machine," he muttered. Elena glanced over and chuckled. "We have instant coffee. It's good for lowering expectations." The kitchen was tiny. Hot water had to be boiled manually, and the washing machine was an ancient hand-crank model. Logan, a man used to smart appliances and voice assistants, looked like he'd landed in the 19th century. Every time he tried to help, Elena had to rescue him from yet another minor disaster. Like the time he tried to toast bread but forgot he'd turned on the gas, filling the kitchen with smoke. "Step aside," Elena said, quickly putting out the flame with practiced ease. "You're like a kid on his first day in the kitchen." "I'm a city man, not a farmer," Logan grumbled, but he couldn't help smiling back. Slowly, between simple meals and afternoons spent weeding the garden, the two of them began to open up. Logan spoke about the pressures of his work, the billion-dollar deals that outsiders admired but were really nothing but stress and cold calculations. Elena shared stories of her humble childhood, how she once dreamed of opening a small art gallery, dreams that ended abruptly when her parents passed away. "My life," she said, "has always been full of plans that got cut short, but at least I know what I'm living for, my brother." Logan sat silently, realizing for the first time that resilience didn't always come from being tough or emotionless. Sometimes it came from accepting the chaos and continuing anyway. On the fifth evening, after a long day of yard work, they sat on the porch sipping hot tea. Neither of them said much, just watched as the sunset painted gold across the fields. Then, quietly, Logan asked, "Elena, do you regret saying yes to this?" She turned to him, eyes soft but honest. "At first, yes. But now, no." He nodded slowly. "Me neither." That moment didn't need more words. The silence was enough. It spoke of something shifting. No longer two strangers bound by a deal, but two people slowly stepping into each other's world in the most genuine way. On the sixth night, the wind rustled through the pine trees, making the little cabin creak in protest. Bathed in the soft amber glow of an oil lamp, Logan and Elena sat in the living room, wrapped in a thin blanket, each holding a warm mug of tea. No television, no phones, no distractions, just the wind and the occasional groan of old wood. "It's going to rain tomorrow," Elena said, gazing out the foggy window. "Rain's beautiful here." "You used to live like this?" Logan asked, his voice softer than usual. She nodded. "When I was little, our home was out in the countryside too. Just me, my parents, and my brother. Everything was simple, but it was warm." Logan fell silent. After a long pause, he said, almost to himself, "I hate the rain." Elena turned to him. "Why?" He stared into his mug, fingers tracing the rim. "Because my mother left on a rainy day. I remember it clearly. She didn't cry, didn't hug me, just said, 'I'm sorry,' and got into the car. My dad and I stood under the porch. We couldn't say anything. We just watched her go." Elena said nothing. She slowly placed her hand on his, not to console, but simply to say, "I'm here." "My dad never recovered," Logan continued. "He buried himself in silence, in work, in drinking. And I told myself I'd never be like him, never fall for anyone, never let someone get close enough to hurt me." Her eyes softened. "But if you let fear stop you from loving, then the pain already won." That sentence hit Logan like a quiet arrow. He turned to her, not as a man of wealth or power, not as someone controlling a contract, but as a man finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. "You're not like anyone else," he said quietly. "You don't judge, you don't pry, you're just there." Elena smiled gently. "Because I've had my own wounds, and I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply listen." In that moment, time seemed to pause. Logan felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years, lifted. There was no kiss, no romantic music, just two people sitting in an old wooden cabin in the middle of the woods and feeling safe. And that was the very first time Logan West understood what love might really mean. On the seventh afternoon, the sky turned gray, heavy with thick clouds. Logan was working on the back fence when Elena asked if she could walk into the nearby town to pick up some groceries. She needed the fresh air, a moment to sort through the emotions quietly stirring inside her. Though she hadn't said it aloud, she knew her heart was beginning to shift, and that scared her more than she cared to admit. The town was peaceful, almost storybook-like. Elena had just stepped out of the bakery, holding a paper bag of warm bread, when a voice froze her in place. "Elena." She turned. Kyle. He looked the same, polished suit, confident grin, and those calculating eyes that never lost their edge. Over a year ago, Kyle had left Elena during her darkest time, when she lost her parents and was drowning in debt. He chose wealth and status over love, walking away without so much as a goodbye. "You look different," Kyle said, stepping closer. Heard you got married? Elena kept her tone even. Yes, I live nearby. With Logan West, real estate mogul, you've certainly learned how to pick 'em. What are you doing here? She asked, voice tight. I had some business nearby. Then I heard a little rumor. You and Logan playing house out here in the countryside. Didn't think you'd go down this road. What road? You know, he shrugged. Marrying rich to escape your problems. But you don't have to fake it. I'm still here, Elena. If you came back... Don't, she cut him off sharply. I don't need you. Not anymore. Kyle faltered. His smile flickered, replaced by something darker. You think Logan love you? You're just a prop in his little show. The words struck like a whisper of doubt. Soft, but precise. Elena froze. Then Logan's voice came from behind, low and steady. Is there a problem here? They both turned. Logan stood there, still slick with sweat from working outside, his eyes locked on Kyle with unwavering focus. He walked forward and placed himself between Elena and her ex like a human shield. Who are you? Logan asked, his tone cool but dangerous. I'm from her past, Kyle smirked. Just reminding her that not everyone loves her for who she really is. And I'm here to remind you, Logan replied calmly, that she doesn't need your reminders or your approval. In that moment, Elena didn't say a word. She just looked at Logan, a man she once thought was all walls and contracts, now standing before her not as an employer, but as someone willing to protect her pride, not just her body. Kyle scoffed. Right, well, good luck to you both. He turned and left, disappearing down the cobbled street, leaving behind a breeze and a silence charged with meaning. Logan looked at Elena. You okay? She nodded. But her eyes shimmered with something new. Trust. On the morning of the 8th day, a call from Mr. Aldridge shifted the entire mood of the little cabin. The lawyer requested Logan and Elena return to the city immediately for a final evaluation, a private meeting to determine the legitimacy of their marriage. Their SUV rolled out of town before the sun had fully risen. Logan drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Elena stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't afraid of lying because they weren't acting anymore. But could someone like Mr. Aldridge see that? The conference room on the top floor of the West Group building felt cold and sterile. Mr. Aldridge was already seated behind a large desk, his notepad open, eyes sharp like a man preparing for dissection. Please, sit, he said flatly. Just a few questions. I expect complete honesty. Logan nodded. Elena took a deep breath. When did you meet her? 8 months ago. She worked in my home, Logan replied. And what made you think she could be your wife? Logan glanced at Elena. She was the first person who didn't look at me like I was a walking credit card. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. Miss Elena, can you describe the moment you accepted his proposal? Elena tightened her hands. At first, I thought he was insane. I didn't believe a word, but when he looked at me and said, "You're the only one I can trust in this game," I believed him. No one smiled, no one shrugged. Every answer carried a hint of trembling, not out of fear, but because this wasn't a performance anymore. Aldridge jotted something down, then looked up. You're aware that if I detect any sign of fabrication, the will is void? We know, Logan said calmly, but we've got nothing to fake anymore. The room held a moment of stillness. Then Mr. Aldridge closed his notebook and stood. I'm not fully convinced, but I believe the way you look at each other. And sometimes, that's enough. Logan and Elena left the room in silence, but their steps felt lighter, because for the first time, they weren't proving anything, except that what they had was real. Day 10. The West Estate buzzed with footsteps and quiet chatter. Family, friends, and key stakeholders had gathered to witness the final stage of the will's condition. But for Logan and Elena, this wasn't a performance anymore. Elena stood before a mirror, smoothing out a simple olive green dress. Not a wedding gown, but elegant enough for a meaningful day. In her reflection, she didn't see a maid anymore. She saw a woman who had dared to take a chance and come out stronger. In the room next door, Logan adjusted his tie. His eyes, once guarded, now softened. In the mirror, he didn't see the cold businessman. He saw a man in love. When they entered the grand hall, all eyes turned to them. Mr. Aldrich stood at the front with the final declaration, but before he could say a word, Logan squeezed Elena's hand and stepped forward. "I know this began as a contract," he said, voice steady but trembling at the edges. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like a deal. In these 10 days, I didn't just find someone I could trust. I found the one person who made me feel whole again. You reminded me that I still had a heart and that it was worth something." He turned to Elena, his gaze holding everything words couldn't. "I love you, not because of a will, not because of pressure, but because you taught me what it means to be real." Elena's eyes shimmered with tears. She took a step closer and whispered, "I came here for survival, but I stayed because I found home. I love you too, Logan." In that moment, there was no more doubt. They hadn't just fulfilled a condition, they had begun a real life together.